The midday sun cast a golden glow over the sprawling city of Austin, Texas. The air outside shimmered with heat, but inside the grand, glass-walled lobby of Lone Star Federal Bank, the atmosphere was cool and composed. The soft murmur of conversations blended with the steady clicking of keyboards as tellers processed transactions, and the hum of the morning rush had begun to settle. Amidst the routine efficiency, a man strode through the entrance with effortless poise. He was tall, his features sharp, exuding a quiet confidence that commanded attention without demanding it. His charcoal gray suit was impeccably tailored, not flashy, but deliberate. His name was Lucas Calloway, a name unfamiliar to most within these walls, but one they would not soon forget. Lucas approached the nearest customer service counter, offering the clerk a polite but measured smile. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," he said smoothly. Before the clerk could even respond, a firm voice cut through the air like a blade. "I'll take care of this," came the sharp interjection. The words belonged to Victor Langley, the bank manager, a man whose presence alone was enough to make his employees straighten in their chairs. Victor Langley's tone was anything but welcoming. It carried a deliberate edge, as if Lucas's very presence was an inconvenience, a disruption to the bank's carefully curated order. Known for his strict demeanor, Victor prided himself on being the self-proclaimed gatekeeper of Lone Star Federal Bank. He enjoyed moments like this when he could flex his authority unchecked. With a practiced, tight-lipped smile that never quite reached his eyes, he closed the distance between them. "Sir," Victor said, his gaze flicking over Lucas with thinly veiled skepticism, "we have certain policies here. I'm going to need proper identification before we can move forward." Lucas didn't flinch. Maintaining his calm composure, he reached into his pocket, retrieved his ID, and slid it across the counter. Then he waited. Victor picked it up, examining it longer than necessary. His jaw tightened, his expression hardening with something between doubt and distrust. "What's the purpose of your visit today?" he asked, his voice sharper now, as though Lucas required extra scrutiny. "I'd like to withdraw from my account," Lucas responded evenly, his tone firm but unbothered. Victor glanced at the ID again, then back at Lucas, as if waiting for something to confirm his suspicions. "I'm sorry, but we can't process this without additional verification. I'm sure you understand it's just policy." Lucas raised an eyebrow, his patience unshaken. "Policy, or something else?" A noticeable shift rippled through the room. Nearby employees and customers had begun to pick up on the tension, their sideways glances betraying a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Lucas said nothing more. He simply held Victor's gaze, waiting, challenging him without a word. Victor cleared his throat, his voice rising just enough to make a point. "If you don't have further verification, I'd suggest you return when you do." Lucas tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I see," he said, his voice even, though it carried a weight that lingered. "So you're refusing to serve me?" Victor stiffened. "I didn't say that," he snapped, a hint of color rising to his face. "But we take fraud very seriously here, sir. I'm sure you understand." Lucas held his gaze for another long moment, then gave a slow, knowing nod. "Oh, I understand," he said quietly, "more than you think." The tension in the room thickened, hanging in the air like an approaching storm. But Lucas didn't raise his voice. He didn't shift, didn't fidget. Instead, with practiced ease, he slipped a hand into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black phone. A few taps, and he placed a call, his voice low, controlled, unwavering. "Yes, this is Lucas. Could you send someone down to Lone Star Federal Bank? Seems there's been a misunderstanding." He ended the call as smoothly as he'd started it, then turned his gaze back to Victor. The bank manager's confidence wavered, confusion flickering across his features. "Let's wait a moment," Lucas said, a faint, unreadable smile playing at the corner of his lips. The seconds that followed stretched unbearably long. A hush fell over the room, thick with silent speculation. Eyes darted toward them, some hesitant, others openly watching. Victor shifted behind the counter, his fingers tapping against his forearm as he struggled to decide his next move. Lucas, however, remained composed, hands clasped, shoulders relaxed, as if everything was playing out exactly as he had anticipated. The muffled rustle of paperwork and an awkward cough were the only sounds breaking the silence. Customers shifted in place, some feigning disinterest, others unable to tear their eyes away. Victor, desperate to reassert control, folded his arms and leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the thinly veiled authority of a man clinging to power. "You can't expect special treatment, sir," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "Rules are rules." Lucas met his stare, unwavering. "I'm not asking for special treatment," he said evenly. "Just the same treatment as anyone else." The simplicity of the statement only seemed to aggravate Victor further. "You people always think." He caught himself too late. The words hung in the air, irreversible. His face blanched, then turned an unmistakable shade of red. Lucas didn't flinch, but something in his eyes sharpened. "You people," he repeated, his tone quiet, but razor-sharp. Victor swallowed, floundering under the weight of a room now fully tuned in to their exchange. "I meant customers who don't follow proper procedures," he stammered. By now, even the clerks had stopped pretending to work. Their eyes flicked back and forth between Lucas and Victor, captivated by the slow unraveling of the scene. Near the teller stations, a young woman named Emily leaned toward her colleague, whispering under her breath, "You think he's gonna call the cops?" Her co-worker, a nervous-looking man in his 20s, gave a tight shrug. "Victor loves throwing his weight around, but this guy, he doesn't look rattled." Meanwhile, Victor had picked up a clipboard, feigning interest in a stack of papers and empty gesture, as if the confrontation didn't deserve his full attention. "If you can't provide additional proof of your account, I'll have to ask you to leave," he said, his voice clipped and firm. Lucas let out a quiet chuckle, the kind that carried no warmth. "You seem awfully sure of yourself, Mr. Langley." Victor straightened, puffing out his chest. "That's my job, ensuring this bank operates with integrity." Lucas tilted his head slightly, repeating the word with a weight that made it land differently. "Integrity." He turned slightly, letting his voice carry through the lobby. "Is this what Lone Star Federal Bank calls integrity?" Denying service based on assumptions, Victor's face hardened. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to leave if you continue disrupting business." And then, as if on cue, the glass doors at the front of the bank slid open with a quiet hiss. A tall man in a gray suit strode in, his steps purposeful, his presence commanding. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Heads turned, the hushed murmurs giving way to a new kind of silence, one charged with anticipation. The man walked directly to where Lucas stood. "Mr. Calloway," he said, his tone laced with deference. "I came as quickly as I could." The entire room stilled. Victor blinked, looking between Lucas and the newcomer, his bravado faltering. "Mr. Calloway," he repeated, his voice betraying his sudden uncertainty. The man in the gray suit turned to Victor, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Mr. Langley," he said. "Lucas Calloway, the principal owner of Lone Star Federal Bank." The words struck like a thunderclap. Victor's face went deathly pale. His fingers slackened, and the clipboard in his hands slipped free, clattering onto the counter. You own the bank," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas turned to face him, his expression unshaken, his presence unwavering. "That's correct," he said evenly. "And yet here I am being refused service by the very people I entrusted to uphold the values of this institution." A murmur swept through the room. Employees exchanged stunned glances. Customers whispered in hushed disbelief. Near the teller desks, Emily clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Victor opened his mouth, but no words came. His lips parted, then pressed shut again, as though he were scrambling for an explanation that refused to materialize. Lucas didn't wait for him to recover. "You see, Mr. Langley," he said evenly, his voice carrying through the silent room, "I came here today to observe, to understand firsthand the experience of our customers. What I didn't expect was a first-hand demonstration of bias and disrespect from someone in your position." The man in the gray suit cleared his throat. Mr. Calloway, would you prefer to discuss this in the boardroom, or shall we address it here? Lucas turned slightly, scanning the faces of the employees and customers who had borne witness to every moment of the exchange. His gaze settled, steady, and deliberate. "No," he said firmly, "we'll address it here. Everyone should hear this." Victor swallowed hard. His hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles whitening. The atmosphere in the bank shifted. What had started as a confrontation had become something else entirely. Something inescapable. The reality of Lucas's identity had sunk in. Victor's confidence had evaporated, replaced by visible anxiety. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Lucas's voice sliced through the silence. "Mr. Langley, as the manager of this branch, you are the face of this bank to every person who walks through these doors. And your actions today tell me something troubling about what this institution might truly stand for. Or at the very least, what you stand for." Victor floundered, his voice a fraction of what it had been minutes ago. I assure you, sir, this was a misunderstanding. We have strict policies to prevent fraud, and I was only..." "Stop." Lucas's voice, though calm, shut down the room like a slammed door. He stepped closer, resting his hands lightly on the counter. "This wasn't about fraud prevention," he said, his tone cool but unwavering. "This was about your assumptions. You saw me walk in, decided I didn't belong, and acted accordingly. Let's not sugarcoat it." A deep flush crept up Victor's neck. His eyes dropped to the counter, but there was nowhere to hide. Lucas didn't give him the chance to stumble through excuses. "You didn't ask questions. You didn't even check my account details," he continued, his voice cutting with precision. "You made a judgment based on nothing but what you thought you knew, and you were wrong." The staff remained frozen in place, their gazes darting nervously between Lucas and Victor. The tension in the room was thick, but among the customers, murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some nodded subtly, their expressions betraying quiet validation in Lucas's words. The man in the gray suit cleared his throat, his voice measured but firm. "Mr. Calloway, perhaps this is an opportunity to reassess our training and policies across all branches." "Absolutely," Lucas agreed, his gaze never leaving Victor. "But first, I'd like to hear from Mr. Langley himself. I want to know why he felt justified in treating a customer this way." Victor swallowed hard. His throat was dry, his confidence all but eroded. When he finally spoke, his voice was brittle, cracking under the weight of the moment. "Sir, I've always tried to maintain high standards here." "I didn't mean, you didn't mean." Lucas's voice sharpened just enough to cut through the murmurs, commanding full attention. "You didn't mean to deny me the same service you'd offer to anyone else? Or you didn't mean to let your bias dictate your actions?" Victor's shoulders sagged, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I made a mistake," he mumbled, barely audible. "A mistake," Lucas repeated, his tone quieter now, but no less firm. He let the word hang in the air, allowing its weight to settle over the room. "And what do you think happens to the people on the receiving end of those mistakes? Do you think they just forget and move on? Or do you think they carry it with them one more reminder that they're seen as less than others?" Victor remained silent. His face had lost all color, his stance reduced to that of a man wishing for an escape that would never come. Lucas straightened, shifting his focus to the room. "To everyone here, employees, customers, I want you to know that this bank is meant to stand for opportunity, fairness, and respect for all. If anyone here has ever felt otherwise, I want to hear about it. This stops today." The man in the gray suit nodded solemnly. "We'll begin a formal review of this branch and its leadership, Mr. Calloway, effective immediately." Victor's head snapped up, panic flashing across his face. "Please, sir. I've worked here for 15 years, 15 years, Lucas said, his voice quiet but razor-sharp. "And what have you learned in that time, Mr. Langley? That power comes from belittling others, that respect is conditional." The words struck like a hammer. Victor had no response. Lucas turned to the man in the gray suit. "Make sure the review is thorough." I want accountability, not excuses." "Yes, sir," the man said without hesitation. A heavy silence settled over the bank. Every eye in the room was on Lucas, not just in fear, not just in awe, but in recognition. His calm authority, his refusal to let anger control the moment, had shifted something unspoken. Finally, he turned back to Victor, his voice softer now. "This isn't just about you, Mr. Langley," Lucas said, his voice steady, unshaken. "This is about the culture we allow to thrive. Change starts at the top, and today, it starts with me." Victor stood motionless, his confidence stripped away layer by layer. The weight of his actions settled on him like a crushing tide. Lucas hadn't shouted, hadn't raised his voice, but his words cut deeper than any outburst ever could. They left no room for justification, no space for excuses. The commanding presence Victor once held had vanished, leaving behind a man who looked small, shaken, and desperate for a reprieve. Lucas let the silence stretch, the gravity of the moment hanging thick in the air, and then he spoke again. "Tell me, Mr. Langley, if the roles were reversed and you walked into one of my banks only to be dismissed, scrutinized, and treated with contempt, how would you feel?" Victor swallowed hard, his throat bone dry. "I would feel humiliated," he admitted, barely above a whisper. "Exactly," Lucas nodded, his tone unwavering. "And that humiliation, that's something too many people experience every single day. Because of individuals like you who let their personal biases shape their decisions. What you did today wasn't just wrong. It was a symptom of a much deeper problem, one this institution can no longer afford to ignore." Around the room, employees and customers alike watched in silence. Some exchanged knowing glances, others nodded subtly in agreement, while a few shifted uncomfortably, perhaps questioning their own past behavior. Near the teller stations, Emily, the young clerk who had whispered earlier, felt something tighten in her chest. She had never done anything as overt as what Victor had just been called out for, but now she wondered. Had she ever treated someone differently without realizing it? Had she ever let assumptions cloud her interactions? Victor, still struggling to salvage what remained of his dignity, inhaled sharply. "Sir, I don't know what to say. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment." "Apologies are a start," Lucas said, his expression unreadable. "But actions speak louder than words. What will you do to make sure this never happens again? Not just here, but anywhere you work in the future?" Victor hesitated, his face a mixture of shame and uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never thought about it like this before." "That's the problem," Lucas said, his voice even but firm. "You've never had to think about it, but now you do. And if you're serious about making things right, you'll start by educating yourself and others. Bias doesn't just disappear because you're sorry. It takes deliberate effort to unlearn it." The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke. Every word sank in, heavy with meaning. Lucas turned to the man in the gray suit. "Mr. Daniels, I want mandatory sensitivity and bias training implemented across all branches. And I want a dedicated channel for customers and employees to report incidents like this. No one should ever feel dismissed or discriminated against in one of my banks." Daniels gave a firm nod. "Consider it done, Mr. Calloway." Lucas turned back to Victor, studying the man one last time. "You're suspended, pending review," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Whether or not you have a future here will depend on your willingness to confront the prejudices you've allowed to shape your behavior." Victor's shoulders sagged. He knew there was no defense, no justification that could undo what had already been done. "I understand," he murmured, barely above a whisper. As Victor stepped away from the counter, the room seemed to exhale. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, customers exchanging glances filled with a mix of admiration and quiet reflection. Employees shifted uneasily, some with newfound respect, others with an unmistakable sense of discomfort. Lucas addressed the room. "To anyone who has ever been treated unfairly, whether it was here or elsewhere, I want you to know this. You have the right to be respected. Always. And to those who work here, remember, Every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity. It's not just policy, it's human decency." His words carried weight, landing with precision. Some employees nodded subtly, others looked down, processing. Then Lucas turned to Emily, the young teller who had watched it all unfold. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Any questions for me?" Emily hesitated, then bit her lip before speaking. "Actually, sir, just one. How do you stay so calm in situations like this?" Lucas let out a quiet chuckle. "Years of experience," he admitted. "And knowing that anger rarely changes minds, but actions and accountability do." The air in the bank felt different now, not just lighter, but changed. The murmurs of customers and employees carried a new undercurrent: respect. Lucas took a deep breath, his composure unshaken, and stepped toward the center of the room. He wanted to make sure his next words were heard by everyone. "What happened here today is bigger than a single incident," Lucas began, his voice steady, his conviction unmistakable. "It's a reminder of how easily bias can slip into our actions unchecked, unnoticed until it harms someone. And make no mistake, it does harm." His gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on each face, ensuring that his words were truly heard. "We live in a world where people are too often judged not by their character, but by shallow assumptions. It's not just unfair, it's dangerous. It limits opportunities, it breeds division, and it diminishes the very thing that makes us human: our ability to connect and truly understand one another." Lucas turned toward Daniels. "Daniels," he said, "I want every branch of Lone Star Federal to embody the values we claim to stand for: respect, fairness, and opportunity. Starting today, we're going to set the standard not just for ourselves, but for this entire industry." Daniels nodded firmly. "Understood, Mr. Calloway. We'll implement the changes immediately." As he spoke, a middle-aged woman in a floral blouse hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. Her voice was quiet, but resolute. "I just want to say thank you for standing up and speaking out. It means a lot, especially to people who've been in similar situations." Lucas offered her a warm smile. "Thank you for saying that. Change starts with conversations like this one." Then he turned back to Victor, who stood slightly apart from the group, looking humbled in a way he never had before. "Mr. Langley," Lucas said, his tone softer now but no less firm, "you made a serious mistake today. But mistakes, painful as they are, can also be opportunities to grow. I hope you take this as a moment to reflect and do better. Not just for yourself, but for everyone you encounter moving forward." Victor swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I will, sir, I promise." Lucas studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod, satisfied. He turned back to address the room one final time. "To everyone here, remember this moment. Let it be a reminder to treat every person you meet with respect. Because in the end, that's what truly matters. Not wealth, not titles, not appearances, but how we treat one another." With that, Lucas picked up his briefcase and turned toward the doors. As he walked out, the room remained suspended in silence, his words lingering in the air like an unshakable truth. Outside, the city carried on, indifferent to the events that had just unfolded. Cars honked, pedestrians rushed past, and the rhythm of daily life continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside the bank, something had shifted. Employees exchanged glances, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Customers murmured among themselves about the remarkable man who had just walked out, and Victor, still standing near the counter, was left to wrestle with the weight of his choices. The lesson was clear. Power doesn't come from authority or status, it comes from character. From the strength to lead with dignity and fairness even in the face of bias and adversity. And Lucas Calloway had just reminded them all of that truth. But the impact of the day didn't stop within the walls of Lone Star Federal Bank. Word spread quickly among employees, among customers, among those who had witnessed something they wouldn't soon forget. By the next morning, Lucas's actions had become the topic of quiet conversations in break rooms, staff meetings, and dinner tables. At headquarters, Daniels wasted no time implementing the changes. Mandatory bias training was scheduled across all branches. New reporting channels were developed. And a revised mission statement, one that truly reflected the values Lucas had so powerfully articulated, was already in the works. For Victor Langley, the day had been a reckoning. Suspended from his role, he spent hours replaying the exchange in his mind, each word from Lucas cutting deeper than the last. Yet, amid the shame and regret, something unfamiliar stirred, a glimmer of resolve. For the first time, Victor made a choice. Not to excuse, not to dismiss, but to confront the biases he had ignored for too long, to become better. And for Emily, the young teller who had watched everything unfold, Lucas's words left an imprint she couldn't shake. Inspired by his strength, by his ability to lead with grace, she found herself speaking up in meetings, questioning outdated policies, and making sure that, at every step, respect mattered. As the screen fades to black, Lucas's voice is heard, steady, reflective. Every choice we make shapes the world we live in, so choose to be fair, choose to be just, and above all, choose to see people for who they are, not what you assume them to be. The screen transitions to a simple yet powerful message. Judgment limits, respect empowers, together we can do better. The end credits roll, accompanied by a soft, uplifting melody, leaving viewers with a sense of reflection and perhaps hope.